Hey there, welcome to Cozy Historian. Tonight we're travelling back to a quiet English village, a place of rolling hills, stone cottages and church bells echoing across the fields, a place that looked like heaven itself in the summer of 1665. But beauty can hide tragedy, because when death came to London that year, it spread faster than anyone could imagine. It travelled on ships, in the air, through whispers, through fear. Yet in one tiny village, when the plague finally arrived, something extraordinary happened. The villagers didn't run, they stayed. And what they did next would go down in history as one of the greatest acts of courage and sacrifice ever recorded. So dim the lights, pull your blanket a little closer, get yourself comfortable. And before we get started, take a second to subscribe and say hello to your fellow historians in the comments. Let us know where you're tuning in from. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories reach. Now, let's step into the summer the plague came to Eyam and the village that chose to face it alone. The year 1665 marked the last major outbreak of bubonic plague in England, though no one at the time could have known it would be the last. Plague had terrorised Europe for centuries. The Black Death of 1347 to 1353 had killed an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population. Subsequent outbreaks occurred with grim regularity throughout the 14th, 15th, 16th and 17th centuries. London alone had experienced major epidemics in 1563, 1593, 1603, 1625 and 1636. Each generation lived with the knowledge that the plague could return at any time. The 1665 outbreak likely originated in the Netherlands, arriving in London via merchant ships docking at the port. The first cases appeared in the parish of St Giles in the Fields in late 1664, but the outbreak didn't gather momentum until the spring of 1665. By summer, London was dying. The disease was claiming over 1,000 lives per week at its peak. Red crosses marked infected houses, accompanied by the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." Watchmen were posted at these houses to prevent anyone from leaving, a quarantine measure that often sentenced entire families to death. The dead carts rumbled through streets day and night, collectors crying, "Bring out your dead." Before the epidemic ended in 1666, over 100,000 Londoners would die, nearly a quarter of the city's population wiped out in 18 months. The city's response followed established plague protocols developed over previous outbreaks. Bills of mortality were published weekly, listing deaths by parish and cause. Plague orders required infected houses to be sealed for 40 days. Dogs and cats were slaughtered by the thousands, a contemporary measure that many historians argue likely worsened the epidemic by allowing rat populations to explode unchecked. Public gatherings were banned, markets were restricted, theatres closed. King Charles II fled to Oxford with his court in July 1665. The wealthy evacuated to country estates. Parliament suspended its sessions. The Royal College of Physicians departed. The Lord Mayor remained, as did a skeleton civic administration, but effective governance largely collapsed. The poor, with nowhere to go, barricaded themselves in their homes and waited. Some parishes lost nearly half their population. The parishes of Stepney, Aldgate and Whitechapel were devastated. Mass graves were dug at sites like the Plague Pit in Aldgate, where thousands were buried in layers. But 150 miles north, the village of Eyam seemed safely removed from the crisis. Nestled in the Peak District of Derbyshire, about 13 miles southwest of Sheffield, Eyam was home to approximately 700 people. Modern estimate based on parish records. Earlier Victorian eras, historians underestimated the population at only 350. The village's name derives from the Old English Eyam, meaning at the islands, likely referring to raised ground amid surrounding marshland in earlier centuries. By 1665, the landscape had been transformed by centuries of settlement. Stone cottages with thatched roofs clustered around St. Lawrence Church, which dated to the Norman period. The church tower, visible for miles, served as a landmark for travellers crossing the Peak District. The villagers were primarily farmers, shepherds, and lead miners. The land provided well. Sheep grazed the hillsides, producing wool that fed England's textile industry. Lead mining had been practised in the area since Roman times, and by the 17th century, Derbyshire lead was exported throughout Europe. The mines tunnelled deep into the hillsides, their spoil heaps marking the landscape. Miners worked in harsh conditions, but the lead trade brought steady income. The village's position on trade routes between Sheffield and the market towns of the Peak District brought modest prosperity. Pack horses carried goods along the roads. Travellers stopped at local inns. Markets were held regularly where farmers sold produce, miners sold lead, and craftsmen displayed their wares. Social hierarchy in Eyam reflected typical English village structure. At the top were a few wealthy families like the Bradshaws of Bradshaw Hall, who owned substantial property. Below them were yeoman farmers who owned their land, tenant farmers who rented it, and at the bottom were landless labourers and servants. The village also supported various craftsmen, tailors like Alexander Hadfield, blacksmiths, carpenters, and merchants. Life centred around St. Lawrence Church, where the parish register recorded births, marriages and deaths in the same leather-bound volumes that would later chronicle the plague. The church served not just religious functions, but social and administrative ones. Parish officials were chosen from among the villagers. The church wardens managed church property and collected tithes. The overseers of the poor distributed relief to the destitute. The annual Wakes Festival in late August brought dancing, well-dressing ceremonies, an ancient custom of decorating the village wells with flowers and biblical scenes, and courtship opportunities for young villagers. These celebrations reinforced community bonds and marked the agricultural calendar's rhythms. Religious life in Eyam, as throughout England, had been turbulent. The English Civil War, 1642 to 1651, had divided the nation, and Eyam had leaned toward the parliamentary and Puritan side. The restoration of Charles II in 1660 brought the Anglican Church back to supremacy, but many villagers retained Puritan sympathies. This religious division would become significant when the plague arrived. No one in Eyam suspected that the August 1665 Wakes Festival would mark the last normal summer the village would know for years. The celebrations concluded, the visitors departed, and everyday life resumed. Harvest season approached. Miners returned to their tunnels. Shepherds tended their flocks. And then a package arrived from London. The plague arrived as cargo. In late August 1665, shortly after the Wakes Festival concluded, a package arrived for Alexander Hadfield, the village tailor. Hadfield was away when the parcel was delivered to his home, one of a row of stone cottages across from St. Lawrence Church. These cottages, built of local gritstone, housed several families in close proximity, sharing walls and living spaces in ways that would prove catastrophic. His assistant, George Vickers, a lodger in the household, received the bolt of cloth. It had travelled from London, where wealthy clients routinely sent expensive garments to country tailors for alterations and remaking. This was standard practice in an era when clothing was expensive and fabric was recycled repeatedly. Quality garments could be taken apart, turned inside out, restyled, and reassembled multiple times. And in 1665 London tailors continued working despite the plague ravaging their city. Business had to continue, bills had to be paid, and many believed plague was transmitted through bad air, rather than physical contact, making cloth seem safe enough. When Vickers unwrapped the package, he found the fabric damp from its long journey. The roads between London and Derbyshire were rough, often muddy, and packages travelled for days exposed to weather. Knowing that moisture would ruin expensive fabric, causing mildew, rot, and discoloration, he hung it near the fire to dry. This decision would kill him within days and doom the village for 14 months. The cloth carried rat fleas infected with Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague. Though 17th century medicine couldn't identify the mechanism, the correlation between the cloth's arrival and the subsequent outbreak was unmistakable to later observers. The rat flea, Xenopsilla chaopes, is the primary vector for plague transmission. When a flea feeds on an infected rat, the plague bacteria multiply in the flea's digestive system, sometimes forming a blockage that prevents the flea from properly feeding. The starving flea then bites more frantically, regurgitating bacteria into each bite wound. When the host rat dies, as plague-infected rats do quickly, the fleas abandon the corpse and seek new hosts, including humans. Cloth bales and packages provided ideal transport for fleas. Packed tightly, transported slowly, opened in warm rooms near fires, they created perfect conditions for flea survival and dispersal. This is why plague so often appeared to arrive via trade goods. Contemporaries blamed the goods themselves, the cloth, the cargo, but it was the stowaways within that carried death. Vickers fell ill within days. High fever struck first, followed by severe headaches, chills, and weakness. Dark spots appeared on his skin, the characteristic purpura of septicemic plague, caused by bacteria spreading through the bloodstream and triggering hemorrhages under the skin. Swellings called buboes developed in his lymph nodes, particularly under his arms and in his groin. These buboes could grow to the size of chicken eggs, turning black and purple, excruciatingly painful. The name bubonic plague derives from these buboes, from the Greek word bubon, meaning groin or swollen lymph node. Medieval and early modern physicians recognized buboes as the characteristic sign of plague. Treatment attempts included lancing the buboes to drain them, applying hot poultices, or burning the skin around them with hot irons, all ineffective and often fatal in themselves. 17th century medical theory attributed plague to miasma, poisonous air emanating from rotting matter, swamps, or divine displeasure. Treatment focused on purifying the air with smoke, strong scents, or vinegar, bloodletting to remove corrupted blood, and administering herbal concoctions. Physicians wore distinctive beaked masks filled with aromatic herbs, believing the scents would protect them. None of these measures worked because none addressed the actual mechanism, bacteria transmitted by flea bites. He died in early September 1665. The parish register, maintained by the newly appointed rector William Mompesson, records his burial on September 7, 1665. Vickers was 29 years old. His grave remains unmarked in the churchyard. The household hoped it was an isolated case. Within days, that hope collapsed. Mary Hadfield's son from her first marriage, Jonathan Cooper, fell ill next. Then Alexander Hadfield himself. By the end of September, 23 villagers were dead. By October, the Thorpe family had lost 5 members. The Hawksworth family followed. The disease spread in patterns no one could explain, jumping between houses, skipping some families entirely while devastating others, following no logic that 17th century medical theory could rationalise. The plague had established itself in Eyam. As autumn deaths mounted, the village's religious leadership faced an unprecedented challenge. The rector, William Mompesson, was 27 years old and relatively inexperienced. Appointed in 1664 by the Archbishop of York, He had arrived with his wife Catherine and their 2 young children only 2 years earlier. He was an outsider, Cambridge-educated, Anglican, representing the restored Stuart monarchy's religious establishment. Mompesson came from a gentry family in Suffolk. He had attended Peterhouse, Cambridge, graduating in 1659, a turbulent time when the university was caught between Puritan Commonwealth and the impending Restoration. His appointment to Eyam was a typical benefice for a young clergyman from a respectable family, a stepping stone in what should have been a peaceful career serving rural parishes. His wife Catherine, also 27, came from a family of similar status. They had married young and had 2 small children by 1665. By all accounts, Catherine was devoted to both her husband and his ministry, taking seriously the role of rector's wife in village life. But Eyam still housed its former rector, Thomas Stanley, whose presence complicated the situation considerably. Stanley's story reflects England's turbulent 17th century religious politics. Born in 1608, he had witnessed the entire arc of the Civil War and Commonwealth period. During Oliver Cromwell's rule, 1653 to 1658, Stanley had served as Eyam's Puritan minister, supported by most villagers who shared Puritan sympathies. He had served the parish for over a decade, baptizing their children, marrying their young couples, burying their dead. He knew every family intimately. However, the 1660 restoration of Charles II brought sweeping religious changes. The Act of Uniformity in 1662 required all clergy to use the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, accept episcopal ordination, and swear oaths acknowledging royal supremacy over the Church. For Puritan ministers like Stanley, these requirements violated conscience. They believed in simpler worship, rejected bishops as unbiblical, and maintained that Scripture alone, not royal authority, should govern the Church. Stanley refused compliance. He was among over 2,000 ministers ejected from their positions in what became known as the Great Ejection of 1662. This mass purge of Puritan clergy created a generation of nonconformist ministers who lived as religious dissenters, technically breaking the law by holding unauthorized religious meetings, but often tolerated by sympathetic communities. By 1665, Stanley was 57 years old, living on the village's edge, stripped of official authority, but retaining deep respect among the predominantly Puritan sympathizing population. Many villagers still considered him their true minister and attended his unauthorized prayer meetings. This created an awkward situation. The official rector lived in the rectory and held services at St. Lawrence Church, while the unofficial minister lived in poverty but commanded the people's hearts. These 2 men, the young Anglican rector and the elderly Puritan exile, could have been rivals. Under normal circumstances, they likely would have been, but the crisis demanded cooperation instead. As October brought the death toll to 24, both ministers recognised the danger. They understood what was happening elsewhere in England. Sheffield, just 13 miles away, had posted armed guards on its approaches, turning away anyone from suspected plague areas. Towns throughout Derbyshire were barricading roads. Derby had implemented strict quarantine measures. Plague refugees attempting to enter other communities faced violence from terrified residents. If Eyam's population fled in panic, they would carry death across the Peak District, to Sheffield's 15,000 residents, to the market towns of Bakewell and Chesterfield, to countless villages in between. The ministers began formulating a plan, but winter arrived first, bringing an unexpected reprieve. Late November brought the first hard frost. Then something remarkable happened. The deaths stopped. December 1665 passed with no new plague burials. January 1666 brought snow to the Peak District, and the death rate remained near 0. By February, villagers cautiously resumed normal activities. Markets reopened, children played, families gathered. The village dared to believe the worst had passed. What they couldn't know, what wouldn't be understood for another 2 centuries, was that the plague vector, rat fleas, simply became dormant in cold weather. The disease wasn't eliminated, it was hibernating. Xenopsilla chaopes, the oriental rat flea that transmits Yersinia pestis, reduces activity dramatically in temperatures below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius. The flea's life cycle slows in cold weather. Egg development requires warmth. Adult fleas become sluggish. The rats harbouring the fleas retreated to sheltered areas, inside buildings, underground burrows, anywhere offering warmth and protection. Transmission rates plummeted not because the disease had burned out, but because the mechanism of transmission had become seasonally inactive. The bacteria remained viable in dormant fleas and in surviving infected rats. The conditions for another outbreak remained in place, waiting only for warmer weather. This seasonal pattern of plague was well documented historically, but poorly understood. Medieval and early modern sources consistently noted that plague outbreaks peaked in summer and autumn, declining sharply in winter. Medical authorities attributed this to seasonal variations in air quality, believing that winter's cold air was somehow purer than summer's warm miasma. They had observed the correlation correctly but misunderstood the causation entirely. In Eyam, the winter reprieve created false hope. The villagers interpreted the disease's disappearance as divine mercy or natural dissipation. Some believed their prayers had been answered. Others thought the contagion had simply exhausted itself as fires burn out when fuel is consumed. February brought a few deaths. March saw a handful more. April recorded several cases, but the numbers remained manageable, single digits per month. These sporadic cases should have served as warning that the disease remained present, but without understanding the mechanism, the villagers had no framework for interpreting the pattern. Spring arrived with its usual beauty, wildflowers blooming on the hillsides, lambs in the fields, crops planted in expectation of harvest. Life approached something like normalcy. Weddings were planned, trade resumed. The lead mines, which had reduced operations during the worst of the autumn outbreak, returned to full production. Then June arrived, and with the summer heat came catastrophe on a scale that made the autumn outbreak seem mild. The correlation between temperature and flea activity meant that the hot summer of 1666 created optimal conditions for disease transmission. Temperatures consistently above 65 degrees Fahrenheit, 18 degrees Celsius, allow Xenopsilla chaopes to complete its life cycle rapidly, from egg to larva to pupa to adult, in as little as 2 weeks under ideal conditions. Female fleas lay hundreds of eggs over their lifetime. The flea population can explode exponentially in warm weather. Additionally, warm weather affects rat behavior. Rats venture out more, expanding their range in search of food and water. This increases contact between rats and humans, and between rat fleas and human hosts. The combination of high flea populations and increased rat-human contact creates perfect conditions for epidemic spread. June 1666 brought a surge of deaths. July was worse. By August, the plague was killing 6 people per day, an extraordinary rate for a village of only 700, and it was in late June, as the death rate accelerated and panic began to spread, that Montpesson and Stanley implemented the plan they had been formulating since winter. In late June 1666, the 2 ministers addressed the village at Cucklet Delph, a natural amphitheatre on Eyam's outskirts. They had moved church services outdoors, instinctively understanding what modern epidemiology would later confirm: enclosed spaces facilitate disease transmission. The families spread across the hillside, maintaining distance from one another in what we would now recognise as social distancing. There, Montesson and Stanley proposed what they called a cordon sanitaire, a quarantine line. The village would seal itself off from the surrounding area. Boundary stones would mark a perimeter roughly 1 mile out. No one inside could leave. No one outside should enter. Signs would warn travellers away. The proposal was extraordinary and potentially suicidal. For a village already decimated by plague to voluntarily trap itself meant accepting that many more would die. But Montesson and Stanley presented compelling arguments. First, the practical argument. Plague refugees were being violently rejected everywhere. Sheffield's guards had already turned away suspected carriers at Sword Point. Derby had closed its gates. The market towns of Bakewell and Chesterfield were refusing entry to anyone from affected areas. If Eyam's people fled, they would be homeless, penniless, and probably killed by terrified villagers elsewhere. Second, the epidemiological argument. Though they didn't use that term, the disease clearly spread from person to person and through contaminated goods. Anyone leaving Eyam might carry it to communities that were still unaffected. The Peak District's network of market towns and villages, connected by trade roads and family relationships, could become a vector for widespread contagion if Eyam's infected population dispersed. Third, the moral and religious argument, which carried the most weight in a deeply religious community. They had a Christian duty to protect their neighbours. "Greater love hath no man than this," Montesson quoted from the Gospel of John, "that a man lay down his life for his friends." Stanley added his voice, framing the sacrifice as both biblical duty and an act that would earn them eternal reward. The proposal was extraordinary and potentially suicidal, but the ministers framed it as both Christian duty and practical necessity. "If we flee," Montesson argued, "we carry death to Sheffield, to Bakewell, to Chesterfield. How many thousands might die because of our fear?" Stanley, whose credibility with the Puritan-leaning villagers exceeded Montesson's, added his endorsement. Their sacrifice, he argued, would save countless lives and be remembered by history. The debate lasted hours. Families huddled together, arguing among themselves. Some families adamantly opposed the plan. The wealthy Bradshaw family of Bradshaw Hall prepared to leave. They had resources, connections, and alternative properties. Members of the Furness family also fled to find accommodation elsewhere. A few other families, whose names weren't recorded, slipped away in the early days before the cordon was fully established. But most villagers lacked the resources to flee. Where would lead miners and tenant farmers go? Their livelihoods were tied to this land. They rented their cottages. They couldn't simply relocate. Their extended families, their networks of mutual support were all here. And which communities would accept plague refugees? The world beyond Eyam's boundaries was hostile to anyone suspected of carrying infection. There were also practical considerations that made some villagers support the plan despite their fears. Many had already lost family members. They had nowhere else to go, and staying together at least meant they could support each other, share resources, and maintain some semblance of community. Gradually, through persuasion, resignation, and lack of alternatives, the families agreed. They would stay. The Earl of Devonshire, whose Chatsworth House estate lay 6 miles away, agreed to serve as chief benefactor, providing food and medical supplies. William Cavendish, the 3rd Earl, was one of the wealthiest landowners in England. His magnificent Chatsworth House, still under construction in the 1660s, represented enormous wealth and power. His agreement to coordinate supplies and rally neighbouring villages was crucial. Without external support, the quarantined village would starve. His authority and prestige made it easier for other communities to participate without fear. They were breaking the quarantine themselves. Neighbouring villages, while refusing direct contact, agreed to help through this mediated system. The supply system they devised was ingenious. and reflected 17th century beliefs about contagion. At the southern boundary between Eyam and Stony Middleton, they placed a large flat stone with 6 holes drilled into its surface. These holes were filled with vinegar, which contemporary medical theory held would disinfect coins and kill poisonous vapours. Supplies would be left at the stone by outsiders. Payment would be placed in the vinegar holes by Eyam residents. No physical contact would occur. The system operated on trust. No one verified that adequate payment had been left, and no one could check whether supplies were fairly distributed within Eyam. At Montpesson's Well, a natural spring on the hillside, a similar system operated. The running water, people believed, would wash away contagion from the coins left in specially carved depressions. The constant flow of fresh spring water seemed like nature's own purification system. Letters could also be left at these boundary points, allowing communication with the outside world. Additional measures followed. Church services would continue outdoors at Cucklet Delph, with families maintaining separation. The natural amphitheatre's terraced slopes allowed families to position themselves at safe distances while still participating in communal worship. Montpesson would stand at the bottom, his voice carrying up the hillside. The church building would serve only for storage, never for gatherings, inadvertently reducing transmission by preventing congregation in the confined, poorly ventilated stone building. Most devastating was the burial protocol. Communal burials in the churchyard would cease. Each family must bury its own dead immediately, in gardens, fields, or orchards, anywhere but the cemetery, where funeral gatherings might spread infection further. For deeply religious people, this was agonizing. The churchyard was consecrated ground, blessed by centuries of prayer, the only proper resting place for Christian souls. Burial outside this sacred boundary raised terrible questions. Would their souls be properly received in heaven? Would they be excluded from resurrection at the Last Judgment? The theological implications tormented them, almost as much as the practical horror of burying family members without community ritual. But they accepted it. One by one, family by family, they accepted all of it. By late June 1666, the cordon was established. The invisible boundary had closed. What followed was catastrophe on an intimate scale. August 1666 remains the worst month in Eyam's recorded history. 78 people died, more than 10% of the village's population in 31 days. The Thorpe family. All 9 members dead between September 1665 and summer 1666. The house stood empty. The Frith family, 12 burials. The Talbot family, 13. The Siddle family's tragedy illustrates the human cost with particular poignancy. John Siddle and 4 of his children died in the first wave in September and October 1665. His daughter Emmet, approximately 22 years old, survived and was engaged to Roland Torre from Stony Middleton, just beyond the quarantine boundary. The couple had been planning their wedding when the plague struck. Roland worked as a lead miner in Stony Middleton, and their marriage would have united 2 mining families, a common pattern in the Peak District where occupational and kinship networks intertwined. Initially, Roland attempted to visit Emmet in the village. She begged him to stay away, terrified she might infect him even if she showed no symptoms. They compromised by meeting at Cucklet Delph, the same outdoor amphitheatre where church services were held. But they would keep their distance. They would not touch. They would call to each other across the grass and stone, their declarations of love shouted over the space between them. Week after week they met. Sunday after Sunday, after the church service ended and other families had departed, they would remain. He on one side, she on the other, talking across the unbridgeable gap. They discussed their future, made plans for a wedding that kept being postponed, spoke of the children they would have and the life they would build once this horror ended. Emmet survived through the terrible autumn of 1665. She survived the winter. She survived through spring 1666. But in late April, as the plague began to surge again with the warming weather, she stopped coming. Roland kept going to Cucklet Delph, hoping she might appear. He waited through April, through May, into June. She never came. Emmet Siddle died April 29, 1666. She was the last of her immediate family to succumb, though her mother Elizabeth had remarried, and her stepfather would die in July. The parish register records her burial with the same sparse notation used for hundreds of others: name, date, cause, no poetry, no epitaph, just another entry in the catalogue of death. According to local tradition, memorialised in the church's stained glass window, Roland Torre never married. He reportedly lived the rest of his life in Stony Middleton, visiting Cucklet Delph regularly, standing in the same spot where he had called to Emmet across the distance they could never cross. The stained glass window of St. Lawrence Church today, installed in 1985, and depicting the plague story, shows them, Emmet and Roland, forever separated by a stream, calling to each other across an unbridgeable distance. It's a romanticised Victorian-style interpretation memorialising local tradition, but Emmet's death on April 29, 1666 is historically documented in the parish register. While the death toll provides the statistical measure of the plague's impact, understanding daily life during the quarantine reveals how the community functioned under extraordinary circumstances. The quarantine fundamentally disrupted Eyam's economy. Lead mining, the village's primary industry, continued but under difficult conditions. Miners who showed no symptoms continued working the tunnels, but output declined. Markets for the lead were disrupted. Who would buy ore from a plague village? The Earl of Devonshire's intervention likely included purchasing lead to keep the industry marginally functional and provide miners with income to buy supplies at the boundary stones. Agriculture faced similar challenges. Spring 1666 planting happened under the shadow of death. By summer, when fields needed tending, many farming families had lost their primary labourers. Fields went partially untended. Hay harvests were reduced. Sheep still needed shearing, but the annual sheep fairs where wool was sold were impossible to attend. The boundary stone supply system, while ingenious, was imperfect. Supplies came irregularly. Some families had coins to leave in the vinegar holes. Others had nothing and depended on charity from wealthier neighbours. The system required trust, that neighbouring villages would continue supplying food, that Eyam residents would honestly pay for what they took, that the Earl of Devonshire would continue his support. Food preservation became critical. Without regular access to fresh supplies, and with an uncertain future, families salted meat, dried vegetables, and hoarded grain. Those with gardens tended them obsessively. A productive vegetable garden could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Social structures adapted in unexpected ways. With so many dead, traditional hierarchies broke down. Widows suddenly found themselves managing farms or businesses. Children took on adult responsibilities. The community had to cooperate to survive. Neighbours helped each other with tasks that required multiple people, though always maintaining careful distance. The outdoor church services at Cucklet Delph became the only regular communal gathering. These Sunday services provided not just spiritual comfort, but social connection. Families could see which neighbours were still alive, exchange information shouted across distances, and maintain some semblance of normal community life. Mompesson's sermons during this period likely focused on themes of sacrifice, divine purpose, and endurance, though the texts of these sermons have not survived. Hygiene practices, based on miasma theory, were rigorously maintained. Houses were fumigated with smoke from burning herbs. Vinegar was used liberally, not just in the boundary stone holes but in washing, in drinking water, even in cooking. Strong-smelling herbs like rue and wormwood were carried in small bundles called nosegays, or tussie-mussies, held to the nose, when approaching potentially contaminated areas. These practices were ineffective against flea-borne plague, but demonstrated the community's desperate attempts to control their environment. Isolation within isolation also occurred. When someone in a household fell ill, that family often isolated themselves further from the rest of the village. Healthy family members might move to outbuildings or sleep outside to avoid infection. The sick were sometimes moved to separate rooms or even separate cottages if available. These internal quarantines within the larger quarantine were improvised responses born of observation and desperation. Children's experiences during this period remain largely undocumented, but they must have been traumatic. Normal play was curtailed. Schools, if any existed, would have closed. Children watched parents bury siblings. They experienced hunger, fear, and the constant presence of death. Those who survived carried these memories for life. The psychological toll was immense. The constant fear of infection, the grief of losing family members, the guilt of surviving when others died, the uncertainty about when or whether the plague would end. All this created sustained psychological trauma. Some residents reportedly showed signs of what we would now recognize as depression, anxiety disorders, or PTSD. Contemporary medical theory had no framework for understanding mental health, attributing such symptoms to melancholy or spiritual crisis. Yet life continued. Babies were still born during the quarantine, and most died within days or weeks. Couples still married, though without the traditional celebrations. People still argued over property boundaries and unpaid debts. The mundane concerns of life persisted even amid catastrophe. This resilience, or perhaps stubborn insistence on normalcy, characterized Eyam's response to the plague. They maintained as much of ordinary life as possible, while simultaneously facing extraordinary death. They buried their families in their gardens, and then planted vegetables in adjacent plots. They tallied death tolls on Sunday mornings, and discussed harvest prospects on Sunday afternoons. The quarantine was not simply a matter of physical containment. It was a daily psychological endurance test that lasted 14 months. No story from Eyam more starkly illustrates the quarantine's human cost than Elizabeth Hancock's experience. Elizabeth and her husband John were tenant farmers at Riley, a small holding about half a mile east of the main village, up on a hillside. They had 7 children, possibly 8, depending on which records are consulted. When plague struck a neighbouring family, Elizabeth went to help. She tended the sick until the last victim died. This act of charity would destroy her family. In early August 1666, the plague reached Riley. August 3rd, 2 children died the same day. John Jr., age 6. Elizabeth, age 8. August 7th, 3 more died on the same day. Her husband John, her son William, her youngest daughter Ona, age 3. August 9th, Alice, age 15. August 10th, Anne, age 10. In 8 days, Elizabeth Hancock buried her husband and 6 of her children. The quarantine rules meant no one could help. No one could come near. She dug the graves herself, in the hard summer earth on the hillside, dragging the bodies from the farmhouse one by one. People from stony Middleton across the valley watched from distant hillsides. They could see the small figure working day after day. They could not help. To help was to risk death. Elizabeth survived. She had either natural immunity or a developed resistance through exposure. When the plague finally ended, she left Riley and went to Sheffield to live with her eldest son Joseph, who had left Eyam before the outbreak to work in the steel industry. The Riley graves remain today, enclosed in a circular stone wall maintained by the National Trust. 7 headstones stand there. The original markers were later consolidated and reinscribed by a descendant, Sir Henry Burford Hancock, Governor-General of Gibraltar, who wanted to honour his ancestors. The graves bear this Latin inscription: Horum necessitis, orat vigilanti. You do not know the hour, pray and watch. From Matthew 25, verse 13. Not every Eyam story fits the narrative of noble sacrifice. Marshall Howe's story comes to us primarily through 19th century local histories, particularly William Wood's 1848 compilation of village traditions. According to these accounts, Howe arrived in the village shortly before the plague, possibly as a lead miner, and lived at Townhead in the central village area. When plague struck, Marshall fell ill early but survived, developing the immunity that approximately 30% of survivors acquired. Recognising his advantage, he appointed himself village sexton, the grave digger no one else wanted to become. Marshall demanded payment not in coin but in possessions taken from the deceased. He raided homes, claiming furniture, clothing, jewellery and tools as his fee. The villagers hated him but needed him. Who else would handle infected corpses? One account describes Marshall carrying Edward Unwin down the stairs for burial when the body began to writhe and thrash. Unwin wasn't dead yet. Marshall fled in terror, and Unwin survived. One of the rare recoveries after symptom onset. Later generations of Eyam parents threatened misbehaving children with, "I'll fetch Marshall Howe," the bogeyman of the plague village. But Marshall's wife Joan and their 2-year-old son died in August 1666, possibly infected by contaminated items he'd brought home. Marshall Howe survived the plague and lived until 1698, but he lived with what he had done. Rector William Mompesson continued his duties throughout the crisis. He visited the sick when possible, led outdoor services, and maintained the parish register with meticulous care, recording each death in careful script. His wife Catherine worked beside him. While he preached, she provided practical care, visiting the dying, bringing food to quarantined families, offering comfort when others were too afraid. William had begged her to leave at the outbreak's beginning. He had sent their children to Yorkshire for safety, but Catherine refused to abandon her husband or the village. On August 25, 1666, exactly 12 months after the plague arrived, Catherine fell ill. She died that same day. She was 27 years old. William buried her in St. Lawrence churchyard, one of the few to receive that honour during the plague year. Her tomb remains there today, steps from where she once attended services. In a later letter, William described his grief. "My ears have never heard such melancholy sounds. The cry of people dying alone in their houses, none daring to come near." He did not leave. He continued his work through September and October until the last victim was buried. The plague peaked in August and September, then began to subside. October brought fewer deaths, November fewer still. The final recorded burial is commonly given as November 1st, 1666, Abraham Morton among the last victims. However, parish records contain minor date discrepancies, with Morton appearing on lists dated both October 5th and November 1st, likely a transcription issue. He was approximately the 257th recorded plague death, though the exact total remains uncertain. Some deaths may have gone unrecorded, some records may have been lost. With Abraham Morton, the epidemic ended. 14 months after George Vickers hung damp cloth by the fire, the plague of Eyam was over. There was no celebration, no ringing of bells, just silence. The survivors emerged into the November air. Of a population of approximately 700, at least 257 were dead, over a third of the village. Some estimates suggest the actual toll approached 350, making the death rate close to 50%. Whole families were extinct. Entire cottages stood empty. fields had gone untended for months. The graveyard was full, but most of the dead weren't there. They were scattered throughout the village, buried in gardens and fields, marked with simple stones or nothing idle. William Mompesson's final act was to order the burning of clothing, furniture and bedding, and the fumigation of houses to eliminate remaining threats. Slowly, life began again. The traditional narrative holds that Eyam's sacrifice saved Sheffield, Bakewell, Chesterfield, and countless other Derbyshire communities from devastation. Modern historical analysis suggests a more complex picture. Some surrounding areas did experience plague deaths in 1665 to 1666. The disease had already spread beyond Eyam before the quarantine was established. Some historians argue that the quarantine may have actually increased Eyam's death rate by keeping healthy people in close proximity to the infected, preventing the natural dispersal that might have saved lives. The death rate in Eyam was significantly higher than that of London during the same period. The village lost over a third, possibly nearly half, of its population. No other community in the immediate area suffered comparable devastation. From an epidemiological standpoint, the quarantine's effectiveness is debatable. The miasma theory of disease that informed the decision was scientifically incorrect. The actual mechanism of transmission, fleas from infected rats, wouldn't be understood for another 2 centuries. The quarantine couldn't have been designed based on accurate knowledge of how the disease spread. However, the quarantine did prevent mass exodus from an infected area into surrounding communities. Whether this prevented or merely delayed spread to other areas remains an open question among historians. What's indisputable is that the people of Eyam believed the quarantine would help, and they stayed anyway. Some individuals survived despite constant exposure to infection. Elizabeth Hancock buried 7 family members and never fell ill. Marshall Howe handled dozens of infected corpses and lived 30 more years. Humphrey Merrill, an herbalist who treated the sick, survived until September 1666 when he finally succumbed. His wife survived him. Local tradition records that Margaret Blackwell recovered from plague after accidentally drinking hot bacon fat, an unlikely cure first recorded by 19th century historian William Wood, though the story's veracity is questionable. According to another tradition, Andrew Merrill avoided infection entirely by building a hut on Eyam Moor and living there with his pet rooster until the danger passed. In recent years, scientists have studied descendants of Eyam survivors still living in the area. Some researchers have explored whether survivors might carry the CCR 5-delta 32 genetic mutation, which provides resistance to certain diseases including HIV. However, this connection to plague survival remains unproven and controversial in scholarly reviews. The mutation is relatively common across Northern Europe, and whether plague specifically selected for it around Eyam is disputed. The hypothesis has been investigated but not definitively established. What is clear is that some individuals possess natural immunity, whether through genetic factors, prior exposure to related pathogens, or other mechanisms still not fully understood. Thomas Stanley, the former rector who helped convince villagers to stay, remained in Eyam until his death in 1670. He never regained his official church position, but never stopped serving his community. William Mompesson left Eyam in 1669 to take a position at another parish. When he arrived, residents were terrified. They had heard about the plague village. They avoided him, fearing he might still carry infection. Acceptance came slowly. He never remarried after Catherine's death. He died in 1709 at age 70, having served many parishes but never forgetting the village where he lost everything. Eyam slowly rebuilt. New families moved in, empty cottages were occupied, fields were replanted, lead mines reopened. But the village was permanently altered. The memory remained in every stone, every cottage, every name on a tombstone. For nearly 2 centuries, the story was transmitted orally, grandparents telling grandchildren about the year the village stayed. In 1848, local historian William Wood published The History and Antiquities of Eyam, the first comprehensive written account. Wood collected oral traditions and consulted surviving written records. His Victorian sensibilities shaped the narrative, emphasizing heroism, Christian sacrifice, and noble courage. Some dramatic flourishes may have exaggerated details, but he preserved the essential historical truth. Eyam had faced catastrophe and chosen to face it together. Modern Eyam has approximately 970 residents, similar to pre-plague population levels. Tourism now drives much of the local economy. The lead mines that once employed many closed in the 1960s. The silk weaving that brought 19th century prosperity is gone. But the historical landscape remains remarkably intact. Green plaques mark houses where victims lived and died. The plague cottages, the row where George Vickers opened the fatal parcel, are maintained as historical attractions. The boundary stone still sits at the border with Stony Middleton, its 6 vinegar holes worn smooth by time. Visitors leave coins as offerings honouring those who stayed. Mompesson's well continues flowing on the hillside, clear water running over stone. The Riley graves stand enclosed in their circular wall, 7 headstones marking 7 lives. St. Lawrence Church, where William Mompesson preached and Catherine Mompesson is buried, still holds Sunday services. The parish register is preserved there, William's handwriting recording each death. The church's stained glass depicts the plague narrative, the cloth's arrival, the first deaths, the quarantine decision, and in the bottom panel 2 lovers separated by a stream, Emmet and Roland calling across an unbridgeable distance. Every year on Plague Sunday, usually the last Sunday in August, the village holds a memorial service at Cucklet Delph, the same outdoor amphitheatre where Mompesson and Stanley addressed villagers 3.5 centuries ago. The community gathers on the hillside just as their ancestors did, to remember those who stayed. In 2001, the service had to move indoors because of another epidemic. Foot and mouth disease had struck British farms, and all farmland was declared out of bounds. Even memorial services cannot escape history's echoes. The Eyam story has been repeatedly retold and adapted. Geraldine Brooks's novel Year of Wonders brought the story to modern audiences. Jill Peyton Walsh's A Parcel of Patterns introduced it to young readers. Numerous plays, films and poems have commemorated the events. UK poet laureate Simon Armitage wrote Lockdown in 2020, drawing direct parallels between Eyam and the COVID-19 pandemic. The poem references thimbles brimmed with vinegar wine, reminding readers that isolation in service of others is not historically new. From a historical perspective, Eyam represents an early example of community-level public health intervention, albeit one based on incorrect understanding of disease transmission. The decision to implement a cordon sanitaire reflected 17th century medical theory, religious duty, and social solidarity in ways that illuminate the period's worldview. The story also demonstrates how ordinary people respond to extraordinary crises. These were not professional heroes or trained responders. They were farmers, miners, and families making impossible choices with incomplete information, guided by religious conviction and community bonds. The historical record preserves both nobility and opportunism. Elizabeth Hancock's sacrifice alongside Marshall Howe's exploitation. This complexity makes the story more valuable, not less. History is rarely simple, and the Eyam narrative reflects that reality. Despite extensive research, significant questions about Eyam remain unresolved. The exact death toll is uncertain. Parish records document 257 burials, but some deaths may have gone unrecorded, particularly in the epidemic's chaotic peak. Estimates range from 257 to approximately 350 deaths. The precise boundaries of the quarantine zone are debated. While tradition identifies specific boundary stones, the exact enforcement mechanisms remain unclear. Did armed guards patrol the perimeter? Were there penalties for attempting to leave? Historical sources provide limited detail. The role of the Earl of Devonshire requires further examination. While he's credited as chief benefactor, the extent and consistency of his support is not fully documented. How regularly were supplies delivered? What was actually provided? The question of whether anyone attempted to breach the quarantine also lacks clear documentation. Some families fled before the cordon was established. Whether anyone attempted to leave afterward is unknown. These gaps in the historical record remind us that even well-documented events contain uncertainties. The core narrative is supported by parish registers, contemporary letters, and church records. But the details, the daily mechanisms of quarantine life, individual decisions, private conversations, are largely lost to time. The historical evidence for Eyam's plague year is substantial but not comprehensive. Primary sources include the parish register maintained by William Mompesson, which meticulously records burials from 1665 to 1666. Several of Mompesson's letters survive, providing direct testimony about conditions in the village. Church records document the outdoor services at Cucklet Delph. Archaeological evidence from cottage excavations has confirmed 17th century occupation and abandonment patterns consistent with the plague narrative. Secondary sources begin with William Wood's 1848 history, which collected oral traditions before they were entirely lost. Subsequent Victorian and Edwardian historians added details, though some romanticised elements are now questioned. Modern historical analysis, utilising demographic records, epidemiological modelling and genetic studies, has both confirmed core elements and complicated the traditional narrative. What emerges is a story more complex than simple heroism. Eyam's quarantine was an act of community solidarity based on incorrect medical theory, implemented imperfectly, with both noble sacrifice and opportunistic exploitation that may or may not have achieved its epidemiological goal, but that undeniably demonstrates how communities can respond to crisis. The village chose to stay. 257 people, at minimum, died. The surrounding area was largely spared major plague outbreaks. The causal relationship between these facts remains historically debatable, but the decision itself, and the willingness to bear its cost, that is historical fact. And that decision echoes across 3.5 centuries, asking us what we would do when faced with similar choices, when the rational thing is to run but the community asks us to stay. The bell of St. Lawrence still rings each Sunday morning, echoing across the same hills, through the same valleys, past the Riley graves and the boundary stone and Mompesson's well. Each toll is for someone who never left, and for everyone who lived because they didn't.